This is a model used to illustrate how demand and supply can cause recessions and recoveries. It also explains the consequences of recessions and recoveries. Let's start off with the demand side. Aggregate demand is the total spending in a country at a given price level. Recall that four expenditure components make up the aggregate demand. They are consumption, investment, government spending, and export less import. You should also remember the law of demand. The higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded, ceteris paribus, or all other factors kept constant. This means the relationship between price and aggregate demand is inverse. The aggregate demand curve is negatively sloped. When consumption, investment, government spending, or net export change, aggregate demand will change. Aggregate demand increases when any of the four components increase and vice versa. Now let's move on to the supply side. Aggregate supply is the total production in a country at a given price level. Remember the law of supply? The higher the price, the higher the quantity supplied, ceteris paribus. Yes, this indicates that price and aggregate supply are directly related. A change in the cost of production will change aggregate supply. Change in cost of production includes a change in the price of factors of production like rents, wages, and interest. A country's exchange rate will determine how affordable it is to import goods and services from overseas. So if the exchange rate changes, it will affect the cost of production should the country import factor inputs for production. An increase in the cost of production will decrease aggregate supply and vice versa. The aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph has price level as the vertical or y-axis. Price level here refers to the consumer price index. On the other hand, the output variable forms the horizontal or x-axis. The term output and real GDP is used interchangeably here. Note that it is real GDP and not nominal GDP because we want to study changes in output produced here. Changes in real GDP is solely due to changes in output, whereas changes in nominal GDP can be due to changes in price level and/or output. The x-axis also indirectly measures employment rate. The lower the output, the lower the employment rate. Why is this so? Let me illustrate an example. Assume we are in a region where fasting is prevalent. During the fasting season, production of food will decrease. Output is reduced here. Firms producing food will cut down on workers as they need not have as much labor as before to produce a lower level of output. The workers would be unemployed as a result. You can also argue that to reduce output, some food producing firms close down and those working in the firms lose their jobs, increasing the unemployment rate. This is the aggregate demand curve, sloped downwards when plotted against the price level on the vertical axis and output on the horizontal axis. And this is the aggregate supply curve. It is sloped upwards when plotted against price level on the vertical axis and output on the horizontal axis. Put the two curves together and we will get our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. The equilibrium is the point where the two curves intersect. Based on this graph here, the equilibrium price level is 100 and the equilibrium output is $5 billion. Now what happens if aggregate demand or aggregate supply changes? It will change the equilibrium price level and the equilibrium output. The following examples will illustrate in detail. If aggregate demand decreases, the aggregate demand curve will shift leftwards. This causes the equilibrium price level and output to decrease. meaning the economy will experience deflation and a recession. The unemployment rate will increase. On the flip side, if aggregate demand increases, it shifts the aggregate demand curve rightward, as this causes the equilibrium price level and output to increase. The economy will experience inflation and an economic growth. The unemployment rate would decrease too. Moving on to the supply side, if aggregate supply decreases, the aggregate supply curve will shift leftward. This results in the equilibrium price level increasing and the equilibrium output decreasing. Here, the economy will experience inflation and recession at the same time, and the unemployment rate will increase. This situation, where the economy is suffering from a recession and inflation at the same time, is known as stagflation. Lastly, if aggregate supply increases, the aggregate supply curve will shift rightward. The equilibrium price level will decrease, and the equilibrium output will increase. This means the economy will experience deflation and enjoy an economic growth at the same time. The unemployment rate is decreasing too. Before we end off, you may wish to know that the aggregate supply curve is not a linear upward sloping curve, but rather a three-range curve that looks something like this. The three different ranges are distinguished by the different colors. Let's start off with range 1. Range 1 of the aggregate supply curve occurs when the economy is in a severe recession. A lot of resources are left idling. With this, to produce more output, firms can easily obtain the resources without seeing a significant increase in their cost of production. So the firms can sell their output without increasing their price. The aggregate supply curve in range 1 is perfectly elastic. Price does not change regardless of output produced in range 1. Moving on to range 2, it occurs when the economy has recovered from the recession but not yet at full employment. Most resources are utilized, but some are still not used. Firms will compete for the resources, and they often do so through bidding. So they will see an increase in the cost of production as they attempt to produce more output by competing for the resources. Hence, the aggregate supply curve begins to slope upwards in range 2 because the firms ought to increase their price to cope with the rising cost of production as they begin to produce more. Finally, in range 3, the economy is experiencing full employment. All resources are fully utilized and firms are producing at their maximum capacity. Output cannot be further increased based on the current technology and resources available. Here, the aggregate supply curve is perfectly inelastic. Changes in price level will not change the output in range 3.